Over now. Okay.
Good job, Maddie.
Get some old man chairs out.
Before we get started, is there anything that happened or you saw last night in the Lord? Anything that happened during your experience last night in worship that you'd like to? Yes, thank you, Elam, very much for that rousing, inspirational testimony. Anyone else have anything that the Lord showed them or did in them while we're getting ready here? Anything? Yeah.
I'm not really sure how exactly to explain it, but I felt like holiness came in during, towards the end when Lauren did that, holy, holy at the end. Okay. And I mean, it was, because I haven't had this experience in an incredibly long time, but I was like sobbing because of what I felt. And when I looked up, you were on your knees, Dawn was on her knees. I mean, everybody was kind of in a totally different posture. But that's what it felt like, that holiness came in. Yes, yes.
Totally agree.
That's one of the topics the Lord gave me to talk on. I haven't really talked on holiness for a long time, so I wrote a lot of stuff. And so hopefully we can release it at some point. And the basics of it is, and I won't explain much, but the basics of it is about holiness is inside. We're so busy with behavior modification that we've really missed the whole point of what holiness really is. Like when you see the Lord, it's holy, and He's holy. That's the first thing that always comes out, is like, you know. So hopefully we can go into that.
Anyone else? What you saw last night? What you experienced?
I thought it was really beautiful the way the kids and just the presence and the joy of the Lord was here. When the King is here, there was so much joy, and the way the kids brought that in at the front was beautiful. And there was such a freedom, I think, for all of us to enter into that.
I experienced a real joy of the Lord in the beginning. I don't know about anybody else. And then I forget exactly what they were singing, but something about what was that? Healing love of God. Am I right on that? Yeah. I'm telling you, that was happening. Like last night, I felt like we had creative power. That what we spoke and what we sang happened. And I was hoping that a lot of us caught that, because that's not just something that happens in special moments. Like that's something that's available to all of us. The one who spoke into existence created us in His likeness and image. And when we speak those things and sing those things in faith, I felt like it was a beautiful example. I think church has always been about practicing how we were originally created to live. I honestly think that's what church is. So when we get together, it's an opportunity for us to practice, like in a safe laboratory, how we were always created to live, so that we get to the point where it's so normalized to us that we walk out there and do the same thing. And I think that is a great way to think about church. It's very different than how we normally do church, but wouldn't it be great if we actually practiced speaking, living, acting, relating to one another like we were originally created to, and then walk out there and do it. So imagine if we actually started doing some of the things that we did last night in our everyday life, creating healing, I forget, what was it? Healing love flow. Yeah. I just, like it was, I felt like it was happening among us. Like, Lori, how's your heart? Yeah? Did you experience any flutters today yet or no? Nothing? Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. Anyone else from last night? Anything? I think it'd be really good to encourage us in what you saw or experienced. Okay. All right. Phil, take it away.
I just heard a bus come through. Wow. Hey guys, good to be with you. Look at them, they're all like, all right. Most of you may know who I am. I have a twin brother, Neil. I'm not Neil, I'm Phil. And I say that just to encourage you that this weekend, you don't have to be somebody else. You're not required to pass any litmus test. It is, I really feel like that the Lord wants us to come into our own anyway and try to dive into what He's given us. And then just learn how to steward that real well. Steve and I, sometimes we act a lot alike because we've been around each other so many years, but it's scary. Yeah. But the Lord wants me for me, and He wants Steve for who he is, and even Randy for who he is. So I want to start just my portion. I didn't even know I was going to get a mic. So I just want to give you permission to dive into who the Lord created you to be and not hold back. And I really think that some of us just need to learn to give the Lord permission, not that He needs it, but He wants to hear it from ourselves. You know, kind of like the story of Samuel, where he's hearing the Lord but doesn't know how to connect to it, and he may pull, you know, people around him to help him understand how to interpret, but still he has to say, you know, speak, Lord, because your servant is listening. I am listening. I am seeing. I am experiencing this. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know where to go and the way you're navigating me right now, but I'm here. I'm present and accounted for, Jesus. And so if that helps you, I'm present and accounted for. And teach me. Is that okay?
So this morning we wanted to start teaching just some basic things, and one of the things that we were actually going to do on a video together, we decided to do with everybody here, is about the divine imagination. What it is, where it comes from, what it leads to. And Mark even touched on it last night when he was speaking. Yesterday we did a Facebook Live video on the prophetic. I don't know if any of you had a chance to catch that. We reposted it. And the Lord began to show us a long time ago, like the divine imagination, or your imagination, let's just use the word imagination, is like the seed of the supernatural. It's like a seed of creativity inside us that the Lord gave us. And in our prophetic classes years ago, we would say, you know, what are you thinking right now? And we would try to differentiate between, like, people's thoughts. Like one of our friends at Morningstar, his wife would always say, I can't see anything. I can't hear anything. And then her husband would say, okay, forget about all that stuff. Just like, what are you thinking about right now? She's like, I can't hear the Lord like you do. And then he would kind of trick her, like, okay, what are you thinking right now? She goes, oh, I'm thinking about this and that and the other. And she was hearing the Lord all the time, but she would not think it was the Lord because it was just her thoughts. And he's like, that's the Lord. And she's like, oh, yeah, it really is. Because she would have to say it, see what it created in the room, and then realize it really was the Lord, not just me thinking these random thoughts, when in reality, thoughts are spirit. They just don't come from nowhere. They come from somewhere. And so when we begin to train people, and this is even what we talked a little bit about yesterday, when we begin to train people in the prophetic, we would teach them how to see and hear and feel like these three primary ways of receiving from the Lord. And there's a lot of ways, but those are like the three primary ways. And so if you primarily just see pictures in your head, your imagination can run wild. And how many of us as parents, used to say, oh, he's just imagining things or whatever, and then just kind of play off, our children, or even we're in that position where your parents would say, he's just imagining things. And it kind of had this tendency of shutting us down, who we really were. So for a long time, we would see these crazy pictures in our head or hear these, just wild things, like even what Mark was saying last night. These things that there's no way, as we say in the South, in God's green earth, that this could happen, ever. And we're like, that's just my imagination. And all of the time, it was the Lord showing us some of this potential that was inside of us and showing us who we were. And either our parents or we as parents or just people in general would just shut it down and go, it's just your imagination. And it kind of became a dirty word in the church for a long time. Like we weren't allowed to use our imagination because, God forbid, it might be corrupted. And you see the scripture where it talks about a vain imagination. And I think it's only one out of 12 or 13, right? 12 places where it's in the New Testament where the word imagination, and you can start to lay some of this out, where it actually talks about what the imagination is. And only one time it's in a negative connotation, and 11 it's in a positive connotation.
And that's actually the only place, like in the King James, that they actually translated imagination.
Right.
The Greek word dianoia, or that's not exactly correct, but it looks like dianoia. The only place that they were willing to translate it as imagination is when it talks about dark or vain imagination. They translated it every other time that it was positive into something else rather than imagination. So we immediately lost this connotation of imagination being a good thing. Right. When 11 out of 12 times it's positive, but the only time we get it is the one time that he talks about it being a negative thing. So here we have, 500 years or 400 and some years of this almost like subliminal teaching that, boy, your imagination is evil, it's dark, when it should never have been that way. It should have been, this is God. This is the creative thing that he gave you to use.
So it seems like for a long time, that portion of us was shut down in our ability to hear the Lord in reference to us first and then maybe other people. And so then we wanted to, talk about how to open that back up again. And you can say dream, like he was talking about dream. Another thing that the Lord hit me with last night, and I feel like at some point we'll need to minister to one another, is in this imagination, in the mind, there's so many times that we feel like we can't get out of a place where you've been bombarded in your mind with certain things that either hold you back, maybe lust, maybe pride, maybe hopelessness, anything. And the Lord is wanting to get you out of that, starting in your mind. And once your mind is free of it, everything will be free of it. Your body, your life track, if you can say, will follow that once you're free. It's like we talk a lot about sin not having power over us, and not because we don't want to sin anymore, not because we can't sin, We can sin. We can do whatever we want. But the desire to sin, once the desire to sin leaves, it begins to lessen and lessen, then we actually sin less because we don't want to. Does that make sense? It's like if you have something in front of you. I was sitting on the porch the other day with one of my friends, and he was joking around. He's a real mature Christian. And he's like, I can resist anything but temptation. You know, he was just joking around. But it's so true. I mean, he was making a joke of it, but we see it like if temptation comes to us, we're going to automatically succumb to it. Instead of temptation does come to every single one of us, and some of us a lot in seasons of our life. Like this same guy was, he's like, when I felt like I was totally free of lust, and he's a very mature, Christian. It's Rick Joyner. I mean, he says this publicly, so I'm not exposing him. He said, when I felt like I was free of lust, I let my guard down. And then lust really came at me. Because he thought, I've overcome it. And all of a sudden, it hit him so hard one time that it just went wild, because he thought, it has no power over me anymore. But it sounds like I'm kind of contradicting myself, but I'm not. It doesn't mean that we're foolish about our mind. We're still aware of the things that hit us from the enemy. We just don't allow it place anymore, because that desire is waning inside of us to actually lust, or to whatever the issue. And I'm just picking that because he said it. And so as our imagination goes, it's interesting that he chose to only use that interpretation the one time when it was in the negative connotation. Even that, when they were interpreting the scripture, to have the same word, but he never assigned it positively, speaks a lot. It's the exact same word in the original text, but he chose not to use it in a positive connotation, because even he was thinking, it can't be positive. Your imagination is vain, is corrupt. When I don't believe that.
Yeah, that word can also be translated mind, right? But there's a much better word when you're speaking of mind that would normally be used. So like just two instances here I pulled up real quick, trying to remember where they were. There's twice in Hebrews where he actually says, I will write my laws into their minds, or on their minds, when it literally could and maybe should be translated, I will write my laws into their imagination. Think about that. That's a huge difference. It's not intellectual. It's creative. You will literally creatively, with your imagination, release my laws into the earth and through the things that you create and do. You release the Spirit of God through your imagination, unless you think your imagination is evil.
I think one of the things the Lord's been teaching me through so many different avenues on this is that, how many know how hard it is to harness creativity? You know, if you're a creative person and you have an outlet, whether it be music or writing, and those things are great, but still sometimes, how do I manage that? How do I get my head around it, for lack of a better, you understand what I'm saying? Because there's so many thoughts and so many, and so even in the business world, I noticed that creativity sometimes is managed through bureaucracy. And we make a heavy-handed organization, and so everything has to have permission. Everything has to be taught beforehand before we engage in it. And I really don't think that is the heart of the Lord. I really feel like that's how the enemy creeps in. And so with us individually, with us, tackling this subject of imagination, it releases us into creativity, and the enemy in between our ears doesn't know how to manage you being that free-willing. And so thankfully with Koinonia, what I've noticed is that there has been a culture created to allow you to be a little more free-willing. And that can be scary sometimes, but it's beautiful. And I really think the Lord's heart, again, is for this. If you read in the Old Testament, how many times they blessed the stonemasons, they blessed the metal workers, they blessed the builders, they blessed everything that had to do with what came out of, that creativity and out of the imagination, because it's the Lord. I mean, only our Father, who creates us in His image and likeness, looks into the expanse of nothing and speaks it into existence. How can that be vain? And so when you start to do that and you're trying to operate in the Holy Spirit, I mean, how can that be a vain thing? So if that encourages you and helps you, great. Because I think one of the ingredients that, again, outside of me giving myself permission to operate in my imagination, I just think it's letting yourself off the hook, that it's okay to go with it because you're acting like Dad. Okay?
So let me just read you a verse and take the liberty of just translating this word differently. In Matthew 22, he says, Jesus said unto them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your imagination. Interesting.
So how would it be different if every place that is in there, that you put a different translation in there of imagination, same root word, how would it change your life? Like, how would you think differently? What's that? 1 John 5, yeah.
Okay. How about 1 John 5? And we know that the Son of God is come and has given us an imagination that we may know him that is true. And we are in him that is true, even in his Son, Jesus Christ. This is the true God and eternal life. So he has given us an imagination that we may know him. Right. Think about that.
In the English, most of the places it's translated understanding. Yeah. So they automatically put this creative part of us into the mind only, like the physical mind where you have understanding or you don't understand. And they take it out of the supernatural realm and put it back in the natural realm, so you cannot even have this imagination towards God. They've taken it out of the creative part, and who are we talking to? We were talking about the creative people yesterday, right? And it seems like a lot of places in the church, the creative people are kind of separated out as special, right? The creative ones, like the worshipers, the people that do art, and everybody else is just whoever. When in reality, every single one of us are creative. Instead of, placing them like on a pedestal. Like, there are certain groups that kind of get placed on pedestals. The youth, creative ones, blah, blah, blah. That's just junk. When every single one of us that we're talking about has this creative seed, a lot of us don't necessarily reflect that through our personality, so we're not creative. Oh, Amanda's creative because she can, go flail around in worship. I'm exaggerating that. But that's kind of the mindset of some of the church. Or Jenny, because she's a worshiper and she writes music. She's a creative one. And that's not true. Every single one of us have this exact same seed of creativity. Some of us reflect it more through our personality and some of us don't. Some of us reflect our creativity through our business. Some of us reflect our creativity through our law, being an attorney. And they have these divine thoughts come to them as to how to solve a legal problem. Like, what is uncreative about that? I talk to businessmen constantly because I'm in the business world. and they have these ideas. I have a client. Nothing special as you would see him. He's just a guy from, Clemson area. Started out literally with zero. He didn't come from money, but he had these ideas. Worked his way all the way up in the business ranks from nothing to, in 5 years, started a business from zero, built it up to $1 billion, and sold it. Did it again. Started out totally different field, from zero to like $2 or $3 billion, sold it. That is creative right there. Even though he's not a worshiper, he doesn't draw art. He could probably draw stick figures. But he's creative in the way of, hey, God gives him these ideas, and he builds this business and goes, wow. Then he finds a buyer and goes, I'll sell it to you for $1 billion. Okay, fine. That is the Lord. He has literally tapped into that part of him that God created in him that he has not shut down like the rest of us have in the realm of business. And I was at his house one day, and we're getting ready to build him another house. We're sitting on the back porch, and he calls it like mentoring, but he's really fathering. He's mentoring these young guys. He's like, hey, let's start another $1 billion business for you today. And if anybody else is listening to that conversation, like, what the heck is wrong with this guy? He can just have the audacity to start a business and build it up to $1 billion for somebody else just because he loves this young guy. He's 30 years old, he's mentoring. And then teach him how to sell it and become super wealthy. We were talking about this with Diane, and last time when she's just like, oh, my brain is hurting, because I'm having to think so differently about money. And you can pick any topic. It's not just about the way we even say creativity kind of becomes a dirty word because it's so exclusive. In the church, we think that creativity has to look like something instead of look like you. Go ahead.
We literally do that with everything in the church. We have a form of how it's supposed to look, and we kind of crush any other expression of that, which is really crushing our creativity, our imagination.
So where did we go from separating the supernatural from the regular? Because to begin with, it was all one. They didn't separate the supernatural from the regular, intellect. So at what point did it start to be separated?
Yeah, I did it. I'm that powerful. My opinion of that is Harold stood here and taught us a couple years ago that when the church bought into dualism from Greek philosophy, we started separating those things out as two different things instead of them coexisting in the same arena, the same realm, or same space, I guess I should say. There's another verse here that kind of speaks to that a little bit, I think. Out of, where was that one? I have to look and see what, 2 Peter. He says, this is the King James, it says, this second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you, both in which I stir up your pure minds in way of remembrance. So, it's just a simple verse. I'm writing to you to stir up, to make you remember this thing that I'm talking about. But if you put the imagination back there, he says, this second epistle, beloved, I now write to you in both my first epistle and this one. I'm stirring up your pure imagination by way of remembrance. So what's the difference? I thought about that for a while. I studied this years ago, and I'm having to look it back up because I forgot all of it. But if you look at it, what he's basically just said is your imagination was pure. Remember? I'm stirring back up that pure imagination which was in you, not this vain imagination that rules you, which we've been taught to believe. But actually, this imagination was from the Father. It's part of your how you were created. And so as he's writing this letter, he's saying, hey, I'm stirring that thing back up inside of you that's been crushed down. Your imagination came from the Father. Now, what you do with it is a different story. And there's other verses. I wish I had them all like prepared to throw out here to show you, but maybe I can pull this one up real quick. I think is it Colossians 1:21? Let's see if that's it. I can't read it in Greek, so I got to scroll. English, here we go. And you that were sometimes alienated and enemies in your imagination by wicked works, yet now you have been reconciled. So there's actually another one. Just give me 1 second here, and maybe I can pull it up. All right, I'm not going to take all that time. But there is one place where it says that we are to, you have to really, really dig through the Greek on that particular verse, and I can get it for you in a minute. But basically it says that you should, by your imagination, literally take these thoughts or these creative ideas and just like, I don't know a lot about wine, but you know, these guys will take a glass of wine and they'll hold it up to the sun, you know, and they'll swirl around and they'll let the sunlight come through it. And I don't know what, there's something that's called something, but basically in this passage he's saying, just like you would hold up this thing and look to see the purity of this wine, do the same thing with your imagination. Hold it up to the sun, see the purity that's in it, and then take that and do what it's created to do. So it's not that we were born with a vain imagination, like we want to pull that one scripture and say. We're born with a pure imagination. And Peter says, I'm trying to stir that back up in you. Your imagination, actually another verse, it says, became dark by your works, by the things you did. You know, so it's what we chose to do with it. It's not imagination itself.
Yeah, that's in Colossians 1. It says, and you who were once alienated and enemies in your mind or imagination by wicked works. It wasn't that we were born with it, but we became darkened in our imaginations by the wicked works.
That's
Yet
like saying
now,
that wicked car that I drove that ran over somebody.
right.
No, it's just a car.
Yet
It's me.
now he has reconciled in the body of his flesh through death to present you holy and blameless and above reproach in his sight. Same thing.
I was just going to add, like in Old Testament, there's another word, I think it's like Z-A-M-A-M. But you can see it, it's sort of the equivalent of imagination. But like in the Tower of Babel, the story in Genesis 11, it says, the Lord said, behold, they are one people and they have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for
That's
them.
right.
And so what they purpose to do is actually, another translation would be imagine to do. And if you like look that word up and do the same thing, you can see where imagination could have been used. And it does tend to be used as the negative. But if you can imagine that it's not the negative, you know, and put that word imagination in there, it's almost like it's a double creation. Like we're creating in our imagination, which might even be more important than the physical creation that happens as a result of it. But this word, like nothing is impossible when they imagine as one.
I think every solution to every problem we currently have or we will have in the future is locked up inside our imagination. I do not think it's out there somewhere and we got to find the right person to fix our problem. I think it's all locked up inside of us. I think the fullness of the kingdom is locked up inside the imagination of people, saved and unsaved. And I think what this that verse in Colossians, Ephesians 4 talks about us being alienated in our minds.
Right.
And then the verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, really, when you were talking about holding the wine up to the light, it says, take every thought captive to the obedience of Jesus. I think what has happened for too long is we've separated our thinking from the Lord. And we've created another way of thinking that the Lord is not involved in. We have a whole different, like, that's how broken this separation mindset has made us, where we can think one way when we're in church and around Christian people, and then we think a completely different way when we're by ourselves or that's somewhere else. And the He's like, where did you come up with this compartmentalizing thing that you've done with yourselves? Would you take every thought that you have and have it with me? Every thought. Thought about Randy, thought about your wife, thought about your work, thought about your future. Take that thought and just have it with me. Think about that thing with me. Don't separate me from that idea. Bring me into that idea. Even the terrible ideas you have, even those terrible voices that you repeat over and over inside yours, just invite me into that. I dare you. That's what I hear him saying. Yeah, don't separate it from me and come over here and have that thought, and then when you're done having that thought, come back over to me. How many people do that? I can promise you I do it, and I know you do it too. Instead, he says, just come over here. Don't be embarrassed because I was like you. Hello? He was in every way tempted like we were. He had that thought. That really bad one. That one you don't want to tell anybody else you're having. He had it. And he chose not to entertain it outside of the Father. And as a result, it never took control of him. And there's where you can begin to trust your imagination again. Because you can have these thoughts in the presence of God, and it unlocks everything God had ever planned. It's inside of us. That's why I love this discussion. I love this discussion because suddenly every thought I have can and should be had with the Lord, and he redeems it all. In fact, in every bad thought we have is the seed of something powerful. It's just been perverted. So in the presence of Lord, he takes this terribly negative thought pattern in our lives, and he uncovers the beauty that's always been inside of it. I think imagination, the reason why so many, I don't even know where you've been so far. He tried to tell me a little bit about where you've been so far. But the key for me is to realize, first of all, that we were made to create everything we think about. It's how we were created. That your thinking is, like, so many of us are like, man, you better be glad that you don't know what I'm thinking right now. Has anybody ever been there? Like, you don't want to know what I'm thinking right now. Actually, that's the point. That's how powerful your thoughts are. They're supposed to be known. We've made it a practice of hiding almost everything we think about. Because we've separated the Lord from our thought processes. We've created this hiding thing. It's exactly what Adam and Eve did when God showed up after they ate. Instead, he says, just come over here, come over here. Yeah, I know how you're thinking about how you look right now. Just come over here and think about that in my presence, and I'll redeem it. That's the beginning of trusting your imagination again and actually believing that what you see and what you think can be powerfully created in the earth.
Something that happened in the natural with one of us, who's one of my best friends now, is Brad McClendon. When he came to Morning Star and he became the pastor of our church there in Moravian Falls, I didn't know who he was. He didn't know who I was. And he came into Buck Petty's house, and Buck and Elaine asked us to pray for him. And Brad prayed for him, and immediately, as soon as that happened, the enemy just put something in my mind about Brad. I'd never spoken to the man, ever. Like, ever. Not, hi, how you doing? Nothing. It was like the first time I ever met him. And I held on to that, just in the back of my mind, about Brad until it was about 3 weeks. So he had been pastor for 3 weeks. And all of a sudden, he said, hey, let's go out to Ryan's. This was in Wilkesboro. He said, let's go out to Ryan's. And so we sat there, and we're just kind of chit-chatting. He goes, so what is it between you and I? Like, nothing. What are you talking about? Liar. Lord. And he said, no, I want to know. Like, what's this wall between us? And as soon as it came out of my mouth, what that thought was, it just hit the table. And I started to cry like I am now. What you're talking about is so true. As soon as you bring that, even the worst thought out, the Lord's like, it's all right. And Brad never even said, oh, that's not true. I knew it was untrue as soon as I said it, but I had to say it for him and I to be friends, to be really brothers. I had to say the negative thing that was in my mind so that I could know how false it was, how it had corrupted immediately my mind toward Brad, my imagination. And if I would have allowed it, it would have just tanked our whole relationship. That's how strong this imagination is. So it was a physical manifestation of something that I had to do to learn this lesson that he's talking about. So as soon as I brought that thought into the light, like the Lord was really present, we're both laying, we're both in the Ryan's for 2 hours crying. Everybody's like, a bunch of drunk old guys in here, you know? Of course, he's younger than I am. But as soon as I said it, it literally fell, and we both just started to cry. Because he could feel the wall, didn't know what it was. I knew what the wall was, but was too afraid to say it, because I was just like, same old bull crap, you know? Because I'd been so hurt over the years from different, people in ministry or whatever, that thought took over our relationship. And I had never even said hi to the man. I showed up at Buck Petty's house, and they asked us to both pray for him. And I went, okay, like, who are you? Kind of one of those things. Yeah.
Can you stay on this for a little bit longer?
Yeah.
I feel like it's really important. I feel like this is really important. I love the whole discussion. I mean, we can stay on this and talk about the prophetic and worship and the whole works, but I thought the whole time as you're talking about this relationship, because so much of the kingdom comes down to relationship, period. And I think about the vain imaginations, which, vain sometimes can be all about us, and sometimes it's just empty things that, have no real value to it whatsoever. It's a lie that we've believed. And I know in my own life, I watched relationships deteriorate because of a lie that someone believed. It wasn't anything I said or did. It was just something they conjured up within themselves, where, this is how they think of me, or this is what I believe. And so I feel like as it relates to Koinonia in particular, a lot of the problems we have are just in those vain imaginations where we're not actually thinking with the Lord. We're thinking in some other area. So, it may just be an identity defect where we automatically think negatively, and so we sense something and we feel something. And so I'll just be really honest here, because I think it's really important everybody hears this, okay? I love these men that are right here in these chairs, and I can't tell you the times that I've had negative thoughts or negative imaginations that have come into this relationship to where I've really had to fight through and say, I know that's not who they are, and I know this is not what they think of me, or this is not what I think of them, because the enemy will want to tear at the fabric of what we have together. And I really think this is where all of our shortcomings come in the church. The reason why churches dissolve, the reason why they have division, the reason why all of this stuff, it's this right here that we're not willing to talk about. That's why I said I think we ought to just really hang here for just a little bit and let the Lord really start to work in our hearts, because, in our imaginations, we can destroy our marriage, or we can create something really beautiful in our imaginations. We can create a family culture within the church that is thriving and beautiful, or it can be just as divided as it is out in the world. In our imaginations, we can have friendships that look like David and Jonathan, where they're almost inseparable. And there's a love there that just seems so uncommon, or it can actually become Jesus and Judas, where a kiss betrays you. In our imaginations, that's the power we have, and that's what we're going with this, is we can create a wall to where we're separated from someone, or we can actually create a bridge where they can come in to everything that we are, and we can go into everything that they are. I mean, I was sitting here thinking about the books that are written and the movies you go to. You know, some of these horror movies, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and it was like, somebody had to sit down and think about that. That's how powerful our imagination is. Like, we can have some really warped stuff that come in, and then we portray it, and everybody sees it, and we call that entertainment. Or we can have something that is rich and beautiful and vibrant. You can take one imagination and make a movie like Saw, which, if y'all don't know, is kind of like one of those horror movies. Or you can have an imagination and create something like Forrest Gump or Secret Life. You get what I'm saying? And that's what we're doing in our relationships. And so I think as it relates to Koinonia, we've got to be honest about these things.
So for me, when I am talking about Brad and that encounter that we had together, it wasn't totally false, the thought. It had nothing to do with Brad. It had to do with something that had hurt me in the past, that was still in my mind. And it still had bothered me. And so there was an element of truth to it, but again, it had nothing to do with him. It had to do with me. And so what the enemy did was, he's just like everybody else. And I went, you're probably right. Just based on a 2-minute interaction where we didn't even say anything to one another. He never even said anything to me. All he was doing was praying for somebody. And that thought hit my head, and I kept a hold of it. How crazy is that? So most of these thoughts that hit us do have a little bit of something that we can grab a hold of and go, yeah, you're probably right. We don't have these conversations with the enemy. We have these conversations with ourselves. So if it was with the enemy, you'd be like, you're such a liar. But if it's with yourself and it's based on a little bit of truth from the past, or it may not even be true, it may be just a fact, something that did happen to you. Even earlier when I was saying that you just can't see yourself coming out of depression because you've been depressed, and you'll come out of it for a little while, then just tank right back into it. And so you're basing it on something that has happened to you that still remains in your mind, in your thing that has soiled, if I can say it like that, your creativity, to believe that you can actually live free from depression. Why is lust, and I was talking earlier about Rick, why is it so powerful? It all begins in the imagination. Why is depression so powerful over somebody? Why are these thoughts so powerful? Because it takes something that's inside of us and just blows it up. And then we can't see our way out of it. And the enemy just loves to separate. Like you're talking about, let's talk about Koinonia. It's one of the most valuable relationships in my life, Brad. So when he went through divorce, when he, went through a big bunch of stuff, I would have people come to me and just start to berate him. I was sitting at the dinner table one time, and this really powerful guy, he's not a nobody in the kingdom. He's, I would say pretty influential, started to say something really negative about Brad. And I stopped him like mid-sentence. I'm like, you just stop what you're saying right there. He's like, what? It's true. Like, listen, Brad McClendon is one of my best friends, and I don't care if he's murdered somebody. I'm not going to let you talk about him that way. You're not going to talk to him about that way. And you know what? If that happens to you, I'll be the same way about you. I'm not going to listen to that trash. And he just stopped, and he's like, oh. It literally just shut down all of the filth that was coming out of his mouth about Brad, even if it was all true. It just,
He actually did something really powerful. He released the thought he had in the presence of the Lord, and it allowed the Lord to speak to a thought process. If he would not have released that, then the Lord could not have ministered to that and caused a different way of thinking. So
it changed his mind.
It changed his mind. Yeah, but it has to be in the presence of someone who has the perspective of holding it up to Jesus. So isn't that beautiful? Like, I feel like at some point in time, you've got to vent that thought. Just vent it in the presence of someone who's going to give you that perspective. I was on the way home yesterday, and I called my wife, and she put it on speakerphone, and I was talking with my kids, and I vented a thought I had, and as soon as it got out, I'm like, that's a terrible thought, and I should not have that thought. And it left. I even opened the window a little bit. I don't even know if you know I did this. I opened the window a little bit, and I imagined that thought leaving the car. Has anyone ever done stupid stuff like that? Like, I have to do that because it's like a physical manifestation of you are leaving and you are not coming back. Yeah. He was able to do that. He didn't know he was doing that. It was like the mercy of the Lord. Go ahead, have that thought in front of Randy. Go ahead, I dare you.
It's the one guy you can have that thought.
Yes. Otherwise, if you vent that in front of somebody else, they're going to go, yeah. And then they're going to agree with that, and it's going to reinforce it, and then you're going to be like, I'm righteous in that thought. And that's the most dangerous place to be. What we have done is we've imagined in the wrong environment. Are you saying amen, or do you want to say something?
I want to agree and give me the mic.
Being married, you have that person that you can dump all your trash on, but it's interesting because years ago, Rick and I would have taken up each other's offense and both been pissed off at whoever and carried it, had the bad thoughts, had the attitude, not loved him. And now it's like, if he's, whatever, I'm going, yeah, but and if I'm blah, 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 he'll go, yeah, but, and it's like what you did. We can do that for each other, or we can jump in and get on the bandwagon and be in offense.
I think the shock for that man when he said that wasn't just to stop him from trashing Brad, was that I continued to say, and if you ever do that too, I would stop somebody from trashing you just like that. Right in the middle of when he was just smoking him. It was really bad what he was saying. But he's like, I can't believe that you would do that for me too. Like, he knew I wasn't angry at him. I wasn't going to just buy into what he was saying. Even if 100% of it was true, it was done out of such a bad spirit. I'm glad he did it though. Because it taught him a big lesson, and it taught me one too.
I remember, I think it was 2 years ago when Joel stood up here on a Saturday morning and talked about being in the throne room. I don't know if you guys remember this or not. There's a few of us that do. Ever since that encounter he had with the Lord, I have trained my imagination to think about me having this thought in the face of Jesus. Like, I imagine myself in that throne room with the Lord, like in the third heaven that Paul talks about. I imagine myself sitting or standing with the Lord in the throne, having that thought. And I imagine asking, does this thought match the environment? And this discipline that I've developed this over the last 2 years has really helped me to determine whether or not a thought is healthy and will produce good and lasting fruit, or if it's a thought that doesn't match the one I'm looking at. So I really feel like if we could, Like, I think this is a discipline that we can walk in together, where this imagining in the right environment, thinking about this person in the face of the Lord. If you think about someone in the presence of the Lord, honestly, you will not be able to think a negative thought about them. You can't, because the Lord's overwhelming perspective of that person is just like, it's too much for you. What you will do in order for you to maintain that negative thought is you'll have to leave the Lord.
Yeah, you can start out with that, but what he thinks overwhelms what you're thinking because you're in his presence looking at him.
And he still gives you the choice of whether or not to welcome that thought he has. It's incredible. Like, he doesn't make you have that thought about that person. You can still maintain your perspective of them, but you have to walk away from the Lord in order to do that. I want that to be heard. In order for us to maintain a negative perspective about ourselves or another person, we actually have to leave the Lord. Is it worth it? Because when you leave the Lord, then now you're actually separating yourself from not just his thought about that person, but also anything else that you could be thinking, doing, or experiencing in that moment. I don't think it's worth it. It's much better for me to release that thought, release that attitude, and think the way he thinks about this person.
Can I insert a word into what you said? Because you said you can't think a negative thought about a person. Maybe I could add the word continue to. You can't continue to, because you do, when you come to the Lord, that first thing, until he overwhelms you with how he thinks about that person. Like you say, you have the choice whether to walk away or not. So maybe it's continue to. Right. So if we're continuing to think those thoughts, we ought to realize, oh yeah, I've actually stepped away from the Lord.
The Lord's no longer involved in that continuing thought process.
Exactly right. So that should be maybe a sign to us that, wait a minute, I'm no longer focused on the Lord because this thing just plagues me, that thought about that person.
So let me give you a verse for that, and I'm going to transliterate that imagination into it. But that Ephesians 4 that you mentioned, it says, being darkened in their imagination, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them and because of the hardness or blindness of their heart. Literally excluding ourselves from the life of God because we're choosing to walk away rather than to walk into what is the life of God in his thoughts.
I think that other person, more often than anything else, is ourselves. Yep. The way we think about and see ourselves, we do it apart from the life of God. And the results are, we begin to project the thoughts we have about ourselves onto other people. Hello? It's easier for us to think the same way about other people as we do about ourselves. That's how we make ourselves feel better about ourselves. I think this starts with thinking about us in his presence. That's what 2 Corinthians chapter 3 talks about. It says, as we look at the Lord as if in a mirror, we are transformed into the image that we're looking at. It starts here. If you allow the Lord's incredibly healthy and vibrant perspective of you to transform you, you will see others the same way. It starts here. That's why redemption you can't just be a healing vessel to everybody else and still remain sickly. At some point in time, that healing impacts you. And then the overflow brings life to other people. Somehow we think at some point in time, God's just doing this through me, and hey, we'll worry about me later. That's got to stop. It starts with us. It's fake ministry that we're doing. True salvation happens in and through us first as we think about, see ourselves in his light. Then everybody else can be seen the same way.
Good morning. I am just so blessed by this awesome conversation that you have here this morning, and this is so a much needed conversation in the body of Christ. Romans chapter 12 speaks about the transformation of our minds. And in order to please God, and rightfully, you've just mentioned that it doesn't start with the next person, but it starts with us. And it brings us back to our true identity in Christ, because the moment when you start seeing yourself through the eyes of God and accept yourself the way God accepts you, you'll be able to see others through the same lens. And this world has given us a wrong perspective, and that's why we are encouraged to not allow ourselves to live and look by the standards of this world, but to have the mind of Christ, to first of all see ourselves the way God sees us, and then we'll be able to see the rest of the body of Christ through that lens, and that is what will bring us together in unity as God is one, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Hey, I'm going to throw in, I think everything that you just finished saying comes back to the question Jim asked at the beginning. And the more I've sat here and thought about what he asked, we can go to all the roots of it and take all day for that. But honestly, go back to this idea of original sin, this idea of the depravity of man. It starts popping its head up in all this when we start talking about our imagination. Why do we think this way? Why are we so, afraid of it? It comes, really the root to me comes back to this whole idea of how depraved we are, and the Calvinist ideas and the Augustinian ideas of, I'm just wretched and wicked, and it's like what I was trying to show in the King James, how that when they translated it, they already thought that way. They already thought, man, we're wicked and vile and wretched and God hates us and all this stuff. And then we're going to translate the Bible for you into English. So there we're going to translate our theology onto that thing. And you're going to read it for the next 400 years, because that is the only Bible, right? So the only true Bible. So we're going to read that for the next hundreds and hundreds of years and tell ourselves, man, that imagination's a bad thing. It has to be, because good is here and bad is here and we're down here. So everything that comes out of us is bad. Everything that flows out of me is wicked. The best I could do, as Calvin said, the best you could do is filth and defilement in the face of God. And so then how else are we to think about our imagination? As long as we want to hang on to that way of thinking about ourselves, as opposed to what the brother just said about, man, how incredibly wonderful he sees us. And when we start believing what he says about us, as opposed to what some theologian has come up with about us, it can literally transform our lives through the power of our imagination.
I think often we can assume the Father's perspective for him without giving him the chance to tell us and show us how he really feels about us. So if, going back to what you're saying, like ultimately it's like what we think about ourselves. So if we think this about ourselves, imagine what others would think about us. And then if others think this about us, then what does the Lord think about us? And so we don't give him the opportunity, because it's almost like it's almost like you're self-sabotaging yourself to see yourself the way the Lord does, like to see yourself like seated with him up there. And I think if we made room, like take our thoughts about ourselves and even others in the presence of the Lord to be transformed in the way that he sees us, not only are you setting yourselves free, but you're also setting the relationships that you long to have free as well.
And to go back to what you were saying, Steve, about original sin, what a lot of people don't understand, we always attribute that theology back to Augustine. And, the reason Augustine comes up with this idea is because he's trying to figure out why he struggles. So you have this pride, like, I'm a holy man, I'm doing all this stuff, why am I still struggling? And so I've got to get this off my back, so we'll just put it on, we'll put it on Adam and we'll make it about original sin. And so with that, this is how he sees himself and begins to see the world. And then when you create that theology, and everybody begins to ascribe to it, then it's really, really hard to get out of it.
many years ago, I was having a conversation with Leonard Jones, and we were talking about music. And somewhere in there, someone else happened to come in and were mentioning the different aspects of music, one of them being, you know, you can have a song that's Hell's Bells, and you can have another song which is entering the closest, deepest places to the Lord's heart. And Leonard had a theory. He said, the music is good. What you do with it, how you're influenced with it, is where it takes it. Years later, I was in a college class, and the professor was an amazing art instructor. And she had been giving us some principles about, you know, different types of paints and medias and stuff like that, media that you could use. And she said something that was almost like she had been listening to Leonard's conversation with me. She said, now, here is everything that I've given you, and here are the tools. Your heart, your passion, your direction, and your influence is going to determine whether you paint something heavenly or paint something dark. The art is good. What you do with it is the thing. So it's one of those things that I guess really it is where, like they say, it's where your heart goes. There goes the presentation of who you have become, or, you know, where you're striving to be, or where you're headed to.
See how you are. I've been reading a book recently that's, I would call it tangential on this topic, but it's been a very practical thing for me. The premise of this book was that every thought we have comes from either our memory or inspiration. Simple, but the memory would be the programs, the life's experiences that you have. It could even be memories that are in your DNA from bloodline inherited things. And so I've been trying to apply this principle of every thought that I have. I'm testing it. Is this coming out of a loop, a program, a life experience, or is this a new and a fresh thing that's coming from the Lord? And when I heard you say what you did about Brad and how it was coming out of a past experience, it was coming out of a memory, that was a clear example to me. And even when you were talking about your second encounter where the roles were flipped, it was the same dynamic as what went on with you and Brad. It was just you were sitting in the other seat. So as simple as it sounds, it just became a very practical way for me to test my thoughts. Is this coming out of a loop of a memory, or is this the new and fresh thing? And so to the degree that we can get our memories healed by bringing them into the presence of the Lord, which was what Mark was talking about. They're diffused, and that leaves you like at ground zero to just have the new and the inspired and the love-based thing.
So I've been thinking about this whole time about giving an example of what a vain imagination looks like, because we keep saying the word and we're not really getting, for me, I wasn't getting a clear picture. So I'll just say I had it pointed out to me once when I was spouting off something from my own head. My friend goes, that's a vain imagination. I went, oh, okay. So I stopped that. So an example that I kept thinking of this morning was, you have kids that are out, they've just gotten their driver's license, they're supposed to be home at this certain time. They're not home till, say it's 10 o'clock, they're not home at 10:15. Then they're not home at 10:30. Then they're not home at 10:45. By 10:45, that kid is in a ditch somewhere dying. That is a vain imagination. Just want you to know.
That's clear. Anybody else before this is a really long walk out here. Hey.
I keep going back to something you said, and I think this is really important. You said for 2 years, you disciplined your mind to have thoughts before the Lord. And I think some of us wear out in 10 minutes of that kind of discipline in our minds. That persistent walk before the Lord for a period of time until our habit changes, until our regular posture, the way by which we think, the manner or the spirit or the motive by which we come into our mind needs redeemed in a lot of places. And that is a process. It is like a unlearning and a relearning. It's a time of discipline. And a lot of times I would imagine a time of humility, because you think one thing. It was awful. And then it's awful. You almost look bipolar, because you go with one thing and then you go, oh, I'm going to flip-flop. Like, I've completely changed in 2 minutes, so I can't, like... I think that 2 years thing, I'm not saying it's a 2-year thing, I'm saying that kind of submission before the Father where you say, I will resource all of me, like every thought for a period of time. And like, I don't think we're microwave people, so I think we'll catch ourselves. You'll be like that for 2 weeks, and you're like, oh wait, I haven't taken any of this before the Lord. Like, I've built whole sandcastles and I haven't like submitted any of this. So like, I think there's a thing where we have to say, I'll do the work. Like, I'll submit. I will give all of my mind over to the Lord. And not just in this moment, but in the next moment, and then in the next moment, and constantly, humbly, like, excavating ourselves before the Spirit of the Lord and learning to reimagine, rethink, refocus, redeem these things before the heart of the Lord, repetitively and without exhaustion, until the holy seed within us reawakens and is reset and refocused and repowered, I think, before the Lord indefinitely. Like, we become eternal because our thoughts are eternal, you know? Instead of just being fleshly and lowly, we become divine again, I think.
The beauty of it is you can fall off the wagon anytime while you're in that 2-year process. It's not for the weak, by the way. I will warn you now. You will realize how much of an idiot you really are and how you think. Honestly, you can think you're incredible as long as you don't think your thoughts in front of the Lord. As soon as you start showing him what you think, you realize who you really are. It's so healthy and it's so painful. And you fall off the wagon, but you do it in front of him. And you realize that you're not going to get, poof. You realize it's, hey, come on, let me show you how. It's constantly, let me show you how. And here's the beauty, and I know you want to say something, Dean, just give me a second. As I've stayed disciplined in this, I now begin to see, and I know some of you can recognize this, when other people are trapped, thinking outside of the presence of the Lord. And so what I'll do is I'll intentionally reach out to them. I intentionally reach out to them. I intentionally let them know how I'm thinking about them. Because you can actually get to the place where you can tell how people are thinking about you. It's not paranoia. Your paranoia convinces you how other people are thinking about you negatively. It's not paranoia. It's actually being so sensitive because you've trained yourself to see how the Lord thinks, that you know how other people are thinking, and you can actually... not thwart, but what's the word about going ahead? You can proactively, what was that? Preemptive. Yeah. Preempt. You can preempt their negative thought pattern about you by going into that. And before they start getting in their cycle, you can go in and say, I think you're incredible. I can't wait for you to be here, or something like that. And it arrests the negative thought cycle they're in. It's the prophetic thing. That's true prophetic. Not thus saith the Lord. But I know where you're at, and let me jump in and show you a healthy version of where you're at. This discipline is not just for us. Like I said again, it starts with us, but it ends up overflowing into the life of every person in our lives.
Yeah, I've been having this example, like since 2011, I've been part of Koinonia, and it just hit my life, you know, and like, so there was like 4 or 5 years that you couldn't think nothing like but love. So you are love, like you are in love with others, like you are having friendships and relationships. And that was a thought flaw. That was my like identity. I was 100% sure in that. But then like I had this time when the Lord kind of closed it, like just close it, just shut it down. And so, like I had the darkest part of my life, 3 years of like silence, the darkest part of my life. And so like he started to show me like complete darkness inside of me. So I found myself in the worst thoughts about my friends, about my daddy, about others. Like, so I figured out that I have all of it inside of me. So I do not believe in anything of that. But like that was during the day. But like what this Koinonia, this real fellowship with the Lord and others did, so every night I was like waking up thinking that I cannot find anything but love inside of me. It's like I'm hating the Lord at some point because he put me in this process, this terrible, like darkest process, but I can't find nothing what this Koinonia did in me. Like I couldn't find the way to lose this love. Like it was so deeply rooted in me that it just made me insane because the situation around me is showing that everything is totally falling apart. Like the fellowship itself, us as family, like everybody around me inside of me are like I'm fighting like terrible things. But the only thing I was thinking that what it did, like this Koinonia-based life like thought process, made it that I could not kind of escape this anymore. And so from this zero and then below zero in the darkest part, I kind of started to rebuild myself into the things that I've already had. This Koinonia started like taking me out from the bottom back to the zero, and right now I'm in this process when I understand I'm building on the foundation that I came from there, like back to the very, very bottom of myself. And so with this Koinonia with the Lord, like there is no option for me not to find love. There is no option for me not to find it inside of me. It's like completely based there, and because of this love, like my thoughts are like captive in this love. Like they are completely there. There is no option to find like I'm surrounded with darkness in my thought process, but within that there is always this like 1% of this like love that is capturing this 99%. It is always more. It is always like bigger. It is always deeper. It goes like even this 1% that we have, like what we've experienced all together with the Lord, like your thought process, that like my thought process was rebuilt with 1% of this love actually, because 99 was complete dark. Yeah, that was enough. Yeah, that was completely enough. Like that's why I understand. Like this is like processing of going from whatever you are. Then like it doesn't matter how far you can fall. You know, like this 1% that we all experience. Like it will never ever give us a chance, like not to come back. Like into this love. So.
The thoughts about ourselves, like Dina was saying, of rebuilding. So I'm sitting here just thinking about that, and it's like we're told to become like little children, not childish, but I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about Casey when he was young, and if you think about little kids, you can just see him out there, like I would see him out there playing and running, in his imagination ran wild whenever he was little. He was out having adventures and all that kind of stuff. So, and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, if we're to become like little children, the imagination that we have, kids can imagine anything. And when they're with the Lord and they're doing the imagination that they come up with, and it's awesome. Okay, so, and then I'm led to the fact of the Lord says, I knew you before I put you, knitted you together in your mother's womb. So it's like, okay, the Lord knew us, so what, and I might be reaching here, but it's like, hey, what is the suppressed realness from the Lord, the memory that we can, grab a hold of to go beyond in our creative imagination to become like him. The memory, maybe it's a suppressed I don't know, I'm just working this out as I'm talking here. But if we could tap into, okay, Lord, take me to the place of you knew me before I was brought and put into my mother's womb, before I came into here, which would be I'm just
And he actually
working
talks
this
about-
out, the purest.
In that same verse in Jeremiah, he talks about what he imagined.
Yep.
After he says, I
For you.
created you, and then he tells him, this
Yep.
is what I imagined for you.
Yep.
So what you're talking about is the remembering.
Yep. So that's what I'm trying to get to, that point of, okay, how can we really tap into what the Lord thought about us and
Yeah.
get our imagination to come to that, to me, that's the purest form of becoming like him.
Yeah. So I thank you for that. I want to read this because as Dina was talking, I think there's a how-to that everyone's kind of, I don't know. I always hear okay, how do we do this then? How do I get back into the right train of thinking, right imagination, so what's inside of me can become a reality? And so when she first experienced Koinonia, she said it was really great, and then it started going to a 3-year really dark place. That's part of the process. Like, you have to go through the destruction phase. This is what it says here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Before it says, having every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, it says, the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for destruction. We've always used these verses as spiritual warfare. I actually think what it is, it's the destruction of everything that suppresses God's original imagination about us. There first is a warfare in order for peace to come. Blessed are the peacemakers. You make peace by destroying that which keeps you from it. There's warfare. I think that's the truest form of spiritual warfare any human being can ever do. And I'll give you a simple example back to the little kids imagining thing. Like, I remember specifically with Anderson, he was convinced there was a monster in the closet. Anybody was a kid and thought the boogeyman was somewhere in the room, or your kids did? Yeah. And I don't know why my parents never did this with me, but the Lord just gave me this. We're doing this with Anderson. I turned the light on, and we're going into the closet. And he's like, we are not going in that closet because that's where the boogeyman is. And I don't know, he didn't call it boogeyman, but he said a monster. And he goes, I said, we have to go there. You have to see what's in there. I didn't tell him he wasn't in there. This is really important. If all they ever hear is what's not, but they don't actually experience what's not, they'll just have to live off of what somebody else told them versus actually doing that destruction for themselves. So we actually went into the closet, here's the key, together. It has to be with the Lord. So we went into the closet together, and he realizes there is nothing in there. But something takes place as soon as the darkness comes. The boogeyman shows back up again. Turn the light back on. Let's go back into the closet, and you see, and there's the destruction process. It was very painful for Anderson to have to go into the place where he imagined there's horrible things that as soon as the darkness comes and Dad leaves, this thing's coming back out to get me. But over time, as we kept going back into that closet, it was painful for me too. Let me tell you, I didn't want to get out of bed. And he didn't want to get out of bed. He just wanted to be afraid. It was sometimes easier for him to be afraid than to do the work to not be afraid anymore. I'm going to let that sit for a second. It's a lot of times easier for us to just be small, to actually believe what you've imagined when you're by yourself. But if you do the work and find out the boogeyman's not there to get you, it's a lie, it's a lion roaring. He has no power, he just roars and acts like he does. Then the destruction begins to take place. But the destruction is awful because we built our lives on the fear. We actually built a life on the fear. And so part of the destruction is realizing your life is built in sand, like Diane said. It's really hard to, first of all, realize that for the next 3 years, I'm destroying what I thought was my life. It wasn't very good, but at least it was mine. But if you destroy it, if you have the courage to destroy, that's why I said the last 2 years has been awful. Because I have every thought in front of him, and he shows me that a lot of them are not healthy. But as we do that, we're destroying every speculation. That's what it says. and every thought raised up against the knowledge of God. So what we're doing in that place is we're saying that what we think is more powerful than what he thinks. And we have to make the conscious decision to destroy that thought because it's against the Lord. Until we put it in front of him, though, we have no idea it's against him. For all we know, our imagination convinces us he agrees with it. But I dare you to think about it in front of him. Whatever it is you're thinking about yourself, just hold it up like Steve was describing with the wine and the light, and let him show you the specks and the dirt that you were about to drink again. And you'll be like, I have been drinking that the whole time? Yeah. And over time, you start to realize there's no boogeyman in the closet, or it's not healthy to think this way, and I can really sleep peacefully, and before long, you're creating a way of life you only ever dared to imagine you had.
There's a story I used to tell, and the Lord's actually changed my mind about the story I used to tell. And it is a story about Hunter. When he was maybe 4 or 5 years old, he would walk up to the doors, and he would, act like a Jedi. And the doors would open, And everybody, would say, that's just the eye, opening the doors. I'm like, no, don't crush his imagination. Don't crush his imagination. Then I had the Lord tell me one day, that's not just his imagination. Like, that's my eye. So he walks up and he does this, and it literally is the eye of the Lord, because he imagined himself opening that door. He says, I see that, and I'm going to open the door. I used to think it was just a simple little life thing, like, don't crush your kids. It's like, no, you're out of the way. It's me and him.
I even remember the story of you and Hunter out on the road together, and it was starting to get really dark, and he just wanted a bright sunny day with you, and he told the clouds, he's like, stop, or something. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it cleared up.
Yeah, he actually, we were just going out for the day, and these clouds just came in, and he's like, you're not going to, stop me in my dad's day. And he would just take his hand, and the clouds would literally go away, and it happened 3 times. It just kept trying to, pile in on him. And this, I want to read this last verse, not last verse, but this verse. It's 2 Peter 3. It says, Beloved, I am now writing you this second letter. In them I have stirred up, this is what we've been talking about, stirred up your sincere mind by way of remembrance. Talking about the remembrance. And that definition of sincere is judged by sunlight. So when you go to the Lord, it's judged by sunlight, the imagination that you have, and then he stirs up by way of remembrance all of these things that are in his mind to change yours. But it has to be judged, and judge has such a negative connotation. But it's very healthy, like weighed. And let's see what the truth of this is, and let's see what the lie of it is. And then by way of remembrance, let me show you and cause you to remember what the truth is, what's inside of me, and let it influence you.
In that same thing right there, he read it as mind, which is what it's translated, but it literally should be, in my opinion at least, your sincere or unsullied imagination.
Right, same word.
It literally says sincere imagination. Not some vain or dark imagination, but it's sincere. You can know it's sincere because you've held it up.
Right.
And said, yeah, that's pure. And then moved on with it.
So I feel like we need to practice just a little bit. Would that be okay to do this before we break? I'd like to practice this, and I'd like to practice from the standpoint of, well, since I have the microphone, we'll do it my way, of imagining ourselves in the face of the Lord. And I know as we've been talking, at some point in time, one of those, either a vain imagination has risen up to your awareness, or maybe a painfully awful thought pattern or debilitating way of thinking about yourself or others that has come up. It's come up, okay? What I'd like you to do is just hold that up to the light of the Lord. Just allow it to sit in front of him. And go ahead, just close your eyes now if you would. And I think the greatest thing that we can experience is the Lord's perspective and what he wants to do with it. So Lord, as Jim was talking, I was deeply impacted by these ancient imaginations you've had about us that we haven't seen yet because we've been so caught up in the vain ones. So would you help us by your Spirit to destroy one of these speculations right now? These things that are against your imagination about us.
So keep your eyes closed. And stay where you are. Like in your mind where you are. First thing that came up when I closed my eyes was the negative. It was that little piece that was true that I had attached. And I was talking to Neil about it. And I saw the Lord just take his little finger and just pluck that piece of truth out, or that old memory. And I saw it happening for so many people. And some of you either didn't want to allow that to happen, you'd held on to it so long, it seemed like it became part of you. And I began to cry even harder inside because you felt like that part had become part of you. And it's not true. And I saw the Lord just begin to heal that lie, or even that event or memory of something that you've based this imagination on for so many years. It almost has become a foregone conclusion for your life. I saw the Lord just begin to heal it. And then he was encouraging you just to walk out of it. That's that discipline that Mark was talking about. Every single time to begin that process. It's not for the cowardly. But he is right there to heal it. I saw stuff lifting off of people in here that had been there for decades. So long. It was like pressure or weight. You saw the same thing? It's just like, it wasn't even lifting off your shoulders, it was lifting out of your heart. It wasn't outside, it was inside. It was lifting off of your mind. And some of you are resisting it because you don't want to break down. I heard you even think to yourself, that's just the way I think. And that's tragic. Because that's not true. Saying it nicely, it's corrupted your way of thinking for so long, it's so hard for you to even think about something else. Think a different track. And the Lord is like, just let go. You can live free of that thought or emotion or reaction or pain or whatever it is. You can live free of it if you choose. And there's this struggle going on in the room. I can feel it so strong. Where he's allowing you to decide. He won't force you. Keep your face turned towards him, even while I'm talking, even while things are going on. Don't get distracted. Let him shine the light on that experience that you had that's affected your life. Let him remember your mind and restore it. Put it back to its right place. The spirit of remembrance, where he causes you to remember who you are and who he is in you, just be released in this room. Just holy remembrance. Holy and Wholy. Holy. To remember how he made you whole. Not just holy, but whole. Thank you, Lord.
One of the things I was experiencing is many people struggle with how other people think about them. You actually have become a complete victim to your vain imaginations of how other people think about you. And if you do this in the presence of the Lord, I'm going to show you the strategy the Lord is teaching me. I'm not going to say has taught, because he's still teaching me. He says the problem is you're thinking about yourself in that thing. When I'm thinking about them. Instead of me wondering how someone is thinking about me, this is Jesus talking to me, I'm thinking about how incredible they are. When you are enamored with who people are, you are no longer a victim to how they think about you. The Lord's incredible perspective of other people can overwhelm us when we take ourselves out of the hamster wheel of how everybody else thinks about us. So I feel like there's many of us who are being presented a choice today. Instead of being trapped inside, what are other people going to think about me? What does this person think about me? What is this person doing? We begin to just place incredible value on who they are. This is where peer pressure comes in. I don't care if you're 16 or 60, you still deal with peer pressure. But when people start thinking outside of themselves and start thinking how the Lord thinks about people and consistently recognizing the value other people have, and you're enamored with it and you're incredibly engaged with other people's value and how incredible they are, it heals that broken mental process of, oh gosh, I wonder what they're thinking about me. I wonder why they don't think this about me. Why don't they say this to me? So God reversed that thinking process in us. When we walk into a crowd, when we walk into a room with just maybe a couple of people, Father, our first thought is, man, I love them. Because this is how you think. Give us eyes to see them as they are. Some of you in this room really need that healing. You are absolutely a slave to other people's perceived ideas about you. And as a result, you're silent. As a result, you stay still. You do nothing. You don't move. You don't act. You don't do what's on the inside of you because you're so trapped in other people's perceptions of you. And they're not even real. Instead, choose that the next time you walk into a setting, your perspective is, look at all of these incredible people. Choose to perceive value. Choose to perceive God's imagination about them. And it'll begin to unloosen the shackles and the bonds that have held you in perfect, really non-behavior. God, heal our thinking in this. Let's take about 10 minutes or so to break. And then we'll come back with our first couple snap talks.